very much for coming out today. My name is Gary Oberbrunner. I'm president of Long Now Boston, and welcome to Insanely Curious, our talk for today. Before we get started, let me just tell you a little bit about who we are. I recognize many of the faces in the crowd, but I think some of you are new, so that's great. Welcome. Long Now Boston has been around for about 10 years, officially. And our goal is to stimulate long-term thinking in the Boston area. We're sort of a spin-off of the Long Now Foundation, which is out in California. That's bankrolled by a bunch of rich tech bros building a 10,000-year clock, which is super cool. But we are not that. We are a grassroots, all-volunteer organization here in Boston. And we put on talks like this with speakers from all walks of life: architecture, art, curation, science, astrophysics, history, mushrooms, and all with the idea that we want to get people to stop thinking so short term. Stop thinking about what's tomorrow, what's next week, and even what's next year, and think longer term than that. It's challenging today, right? Because there's so much going on. It seems like the world's about to end tomorrow. But in fact, we all will be here in 100 years, in 1,000 years, or at least our species probably will survive that long. And it's worth thinking about what we can do today to bring about a better future for our descendants. So that's the question we ask ourselves. How can we be better ancestors? And so if that kind of thing is interesting to you, I encourage you to, you can either sign up for our mailing list on the sign-up sheet over here, or go to our website, longnowboston.org, and sign up there. We have a ton of great talks coming up shortly. We've got, I don't have my list in front of me. That's a problem, right? Let's see, we've got a co-sponsored book event called Coming Soon, The Earth Said Remember Me. That's by Jason Dove-Mark in conversation with Julia Sklar, who's one of our former Long Now Boston speakers. We've got a talk, sort of a Boston Health Innovation Night at the Liberty Hotel on August 13th. Progress in Health and Medicine, The Very Long View. And we have our summer party coming up this fall, actually. September 13th, I think. Tickets will be made available to members first. So if you want to get a ticket to that, they will be very, very limited. Join Long Now Boston as a member, and you'll get a special email sometime in the next month or so when we announce that. We also have talks coming up in September about nuclear nonproliferation, more on mushrooms. We'll probably have another film screening in August. We're working on a ton of stuff. And so before I turn it over to Flory, if you're interested in getting to know us better and working with us as a volunteer, we would love to have you. Come see me or Margaret or John, any of our volunteers here today, and let's have a chat. So let's see. So that brings us to today's event, Insanely Curious, Preserving MIT's Past to Inspire the Future. So Florencia Pierri is an Associate Curator of Science and Technology at the MIT Museum. She earned her PhD in History of Science from Princeton University. They earned their PhD in History of Science from Princeton University, following a BA in History and a BS in Biochemistry. What did I do? From the University of California, San Diego. Prior to arriving at the MIT Museum, Pierri was the curator of the Sarnoff Collection, a museum dedicated to the history of communication technology at the College of New Jersey. And they come to us today to talk about museums, collection, and collecting, past, present, and future. So please, without further ado, Florencia Pierri.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here at Long Now, Boston. So humans, we are collectors. We scoop up shiny trinkets that catch our eye. We collect items with a common theme. We tuck away the wonderful and the weird, the sentimental and the surreal, the things we deem important, the things we deem beautiful. Collection is how humans learn about the world. And collecting is fundamentally human, but also in the somewhat recent past, collecting has turned into an institutional enterprise in the guise of the museum. Today, I want to talk about that transformation, where collections of things became museums, and when museums became repositories that don't necessarily own items, but instead hold them in a public trust for the future. A museum, according to the definition set forth by the International Council of Museums in 2022, is a not-for-profit, permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. It is open to the public, accessible and inclusive. Museums foster diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. So now all of you know what a museum is. So I work in a museum, and I am by profession a curator. That word stems from the Latin word curare, which means to take care of. I take care of the objects in the collection of the MIT Museum. To take care of can mean various things. Along with trying very hard not to drop anything fragile, or anything at all, really, I'm also a temporary caretaker for a permanent collection. I preserve items by sharing them with the public, by interpreting their stories, and by making them speak across time and to new generations. Also, to be a curator in some respects is to attempt to predict the future. In caring for the past, curators must try to foresee what is to come and decide which objects and stories we should preserve for a future we can't predict. During this talk, I'll spend a good portion of time talking about the past. Sorry, I am a historian at heart, and the past is both an occupational hazard and my great love. And this might not seem on brand for something as forward-looking as the Long Now Foundation, but I do hope that by the end of this talk, you'll leave with an understanding that museums are not just about the past, that they are, at their heart, an exercise in long-term thinking, and that they have something to teach us about how to think institutionally, not just across decades, but across millennia. Let me start at the beginning, or at least at a beginning. Centuries before the first museums opened their doors to the public, this impetus to collect led the first Ptolemaic kings of England to create the Museion of Alexandria around 290 BCE. This institution was a space dedicated to the 9 muses, the famous sisters of Greek mythology that presided over the arts and sciences. You might be more familiar with one of the components of this Museion, the famed Library of Alexandria. But the library was actually one of several parts of the Museon's larger campus. We get one of the best descriptions of the place from the first century Greek geographer Strabo, who visited in 20 BCE. And he described it as having, quote, a public walk, an exedra, that is a columned hall, an exedra with the seats, a large house in which there is a common mess hall of men who share the museum. The Museion wasn't anything like, say, the MFA. For one, it definitely lacked a gift shop. Instead, it was more akin to something like Harvard's Radcliffe Institute, an institute for advanced study that is a community of scholars who receive a stipend to work on their individual projects. Central to supporting the mission of the Museion was the famed Library of Alexandria with its tens of thousands of scrolls. This aided in the scholarship of the community housed there. But in addition to these volumes, the Museion also had objects Objects like scientific and medical instruments, statues, portrait busts, and pieces of animals like tusks or antlers. These items, too, aided in the scholarship that was tied to the organization. The Museon as an institution lasted for about 900 years. There is no one day where we can say it closed its doors for good. Even the dramatic scene some of you might have in mind of a Library of Alexandria in flames, which happened multiple times over the centuries, wasn't the end of the institution, but scholars do generally agree that the last remnants of the Museon and all of its attendant institutions were gone by about 640 CE. So it's true that much of that roughly 900-year history was one of gradual decline, but what's remarkable is the longevity, not just of the institution, but of the idea that persisted to the present day. The House of Muses of Alexandria was, of course, not the modern museum we know today, although the two share a common name. The first purpose-built museum that was intended from its inception to be open to the public wasn't established until 1683. That's the Ashmolean Museum on the campus of the University of Oxford. It's also still around today, open every day, 10 to 5. But centuries before this museum opened, we actually see the seeds of the modern museum begin to germinate. Consider the collection of the French Royal Abbey at Saint-Denis. It's almost impossible to give a start date for this large collection, since it was the result of generations of accumulation. But by the late Middle Ages, the collection included hundreds of objects. The core of its collection, unsurprisingly for a medieval Catholic church, were the relics of Christian saints and the often elaborate jeweled reliquaries that housed them. In the center of this image here, we see the bust reliquary of Saint Benedict, which purportedly contained the saint's skull and arm. And you can't see it in this black and white woodcut, but in reality, this reliquary was covered in jewels. And here's a truly small selection of others in this collection. From left to right, we have a reliquary said to house the head of Saint Hilaire, the arm bones of Saint Eustace, a small fragment of bone from Saint Denis, 2 pieces of the True Cross, Saint Pancras' tooth, and we can't forget the finger of never mind, that's actually Galileo's finger, which was dug up in the 19th century and put in a reliquary, and you can now see it in Florence at the Galileo Museum if you are so inclined. So Saint-Denis had other items as well. Some were important to European history, like Joyeuse, the sword purportedly wielded by Charlemagne in the 8th century, and that item is now in the collection of the Louvre Museum in Paris. Others were natural wonders. Here we have what people in the Middle Ages would have called a unicorn horn. When it was at Saint-Denis, it was mounted on a column of gilded copper. You can sort of see at the very end where it was mounted. It was also kept away from the common folk who might have tried to scrape off pieces. And now this horn is a narwhal tusk, and it's in the collection of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, sans the gilded copper column. So these museums, or these collections in the Middle Ages, were closed off from the regular people. They weren't sites of study, as in the case of the Museon of Alexandria, or places for the edification and enjoyment of the public, as we understand museums today. Instead, these museums were closed repositories that showcased the wealth and the power of their owners. The criteria for collection was also different. This unicorn horn was in Saint-Denis, not just because it was rare, but because its owners often attributed to it wondrous qualities of healing and also symbolic associations with the Virgin Mary. So let's fast forward a couple of centuries to the 16th, and we see a new kind of collection emerge. Rather than being owned by monarchs or religious foundations, like the monastery that owned the Saint-Denis material, these new collections were assembled by lesser nobles or urban elites that amassed fortunes from trade with far-flung reaches of the globe. They began assembling what became known as cabinets of curiosities, which had an increasingly different focus from their medieval predecessors. Slowly, the reliquaries were pushed out and other things took their place. These collections had, for example, far more art, both ancient and contemporary. They also had large collections of plants and animals, but even the focus of the natural products that were collected changed. Instead of emphasizing wondrous natural objects, we see an increasing number of plants, animals, and stones that were appreciated not for their magical properties or for the gold and silver that adorned them, but valued for their own sake. It is, of course, true that the love of rarity still lived on. For example, no collection from this time period would have been complete without this curious animal indigenous to the American continent. In fact, if you're looking at depictions of these collections, you can often play a game not of Where's Waldo, but Where's the Armadillo? This is the cabinet of Danish physician Ole Worm. This is a published image from his catalog that was dated 1655. And here's your armadillo. This is a depiction of a collection in Bologna owned by Fernando Cospi, and the image was published in 1677. There's a lot more stuff here, but here's our friendly armadillo. This collection over here is on the earlier side. It's from 1599, and it belonged to the Neapolitan apothecary Ferrante Imperato. Here's our little friend, there we go. It's not a surprise that armadillos were included. These shelled animals were, after all, strange and wondrous to the Europeans who lived an ocean away from their original homes. But still, this is a change in what was collected. So these cabinets are not exactly the modern museums of today. In fact, take a look at this image. It looks insane. So a cabinet might contain shells, scientific instruments, Egyptian relics, horseshoe crabs, ancient coins, plants, mineral specimens, griffin eggs, fossils, rare books, or walruses, and pretty much everything else, all in a seeming jumble. But there was actually a deeper logic behind these cabinets. A good articulation of this comes from the English philosopher and later Lord Chancellor of England, Francis Bacon. In 1595, when he was still a young student of law, he actually wrote a script for a festival at Gray's Inn, the society in London that trained England's lawyers. In it, a fictitious prince held mock court and received advice from 6 counselors as to the best way to govern. In one of the speeches, a counselor argued that the best way for a prince to garner fame wasn't through force, but through reason. To do that, the prince should go ahead and collect a library, a garden, a menagerie, a laboratory, and a goodly huge cabinet, wherein whatsoever the hand of man, by exquisite art or engine, has made rare in stuff, form, or motion, whatsoever singularity, chance, and the shuffle of things hath produced, whatsoever nature hath wrought in things that want life and may be kept, sorted and included. So, shall be sorted and included. So that's a lot of stuff. Basically, you should create an institution that collects everything. Bacon picked up on this idea in his unfinished and posthumously published New Atlantis, a novella that imagined a utopian society that centered around a wondrous institution that encompassed all of the organizations Bacon had imagined in his 1595 play. And part of that was a collection. It was a collection of everything from diverse curious clocks to dainty works of feathers to precious stones of all kinds, as well as collections of animals and plant specimens from across the known world. Here we see a shift from previous thinking. Bacon wasn't arguing for collections to preserve the magical and the rare simply because they were wondrous. He was arguing that collections should serve a new purpose. Consider again this object from Saint Denis. In the medieval collection, it was treasured as a unicorn horn and valued for its supposed magical properties. In Bacon's vision, which admittedly did describe what some naturalists were already doing, someone would collect this item because it was a research tool that helped you understand the reality of the animal it came from. Maybe the unicorn wasn't a horse after all. Maybe it was a fish. So for Bacon, as for many naturalists of the 16th and 17th centuries, objects were tools of learning and collections of objects were sites of study. So these Renaissance cabinets of curiosities represented a new understanding of how humans could know things, not through ancient texts or disembodied theory, but through direct encounters with objects themselves. These spaces were places of learning and consulted by scholars. For example, Ulysses Aldrovandi, a naturalist from Bologna, whose picture of the armadillo we saw earlier, he had his own very large collection, but still, he consulted this collection over here in Naples when he was preparing his massive 7-volume, 1,000-plus page encyclopedia of animals. This was, for him, his research library. So let's consider this image. This is the image of Ferrante Imperato's collection. So Imperato is here. He's the one with the stick, pointing out something in his collection to his two fancy visitors. And you can tell the visitors are important, much more important than Imperato, because they are wearing much fancier pants. The reason Imperato collected was to provoke astonishment and wonder, not just look at all the weird stuff there is in the world, but also look at me, I own all of it. His pantaloons may not have been as fancy as those of his visitors, but his collection put him in their ranks regardless. Even as collectors like Imperato were collecting for prestige, and also calling their collections museums, as you can see here, the collections were increasingly being used for research. They had become valuable not just as status symbols, but also as tools for understanding. As the collectors in Imperato's generation began to pass away, sometimes their collections went not to their heirs, but to the public. For example, when the collector John Tradescant the Younger died, his collection was taken over by the antiquarian, and some say swindler, Elias Ashmole, who in turn gifted it to the University of Oxford with 3 stipulations. 1, that it be named after him, of course. 2, that the university build an edifice to house it. And 3, that the collection be accessible to the public, not restricted to the university. His collection is still the core part of the Ashmolean Museum. But this second part, open to the public, this really was revolutionary. In the past, only respected scholars and the elite could access these spaces. Your pants had to be pretty fancy. But with the Ashmolean Museum, anyone who could pay the entrance fee, which of course wasn't everybody, could enter regardless of their rank. The Ashmolean and later museums that would follow became institutions dedicated to understanding, with objects held not just for personal glory, but in public trust for the future. Okay, so thank you all for indulging me and taking that trip into the past with me. But by now, some of you might be thinking, wait, I thought you were going to tell us about MIT. Am I in the wrong room? I will, and you're not. But I did want to give you a sense of how the idea of a museum has changed over time. So we'll jump ahead now to more or less the present. It is 1861, and the Massachusetts governor, John Albion Andrew, has just signed into law an act granting a charter to a body corporate by the name of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The governor also gave this new institute a parcel of state land, quote, namely the second square westwardly from the public garden between Newbury and Boylston Street, according to the plan reported by the commissioners of the Back Bay. This is when the Back Bay was being filled in, and this was still land that was planned and not as densely populated as it is today. So here is in the center where MIT would be. MIT would share this space with the Boston Society of Natural History. So we see 3 buildings over there. It's a little small, so here's a more detailed picture. This is from an architectural rendering of the site done by the architect who built the first campus. So on the right, you see the building for the Boston Society of Natural History. For those of you who know Boston, to orient yourself, that is now Restoration Hardware. In the middle, you see the MIT School of Design. This so-called School of Design not what you might think. This is what William Barton Rogers, MIT's founder and first president, called, quote, a place for instruction in those branches which will advance the manufacturing interest. So basically, the School of Design was a place to teach people how to make things. Next, you see a laboratory. That's that small building next to the School of Design, and that makes sense. And then you see the MIT Museum in a much larger space than the laboratory and about the same size as the place where the instruction was meant to take place. And not to brag, but it was also going to be bigger than the Natural History Building. This is because at the time of its original conception, MIT wasn't a university in the way we think of it today. Instead, MIT was founded, according to its charter, quote, for the purpose of instituting and maintaining a society of arts, a museum of arts, and a school of industrial science. And I should clarify here, the founders were using arts in the sense of craft or skill. They meant technical mastery, not aesthetic expression. So MIT was supposed to be a place where you learn stuff, sure, but also a place where the public learns stuff and a repository of objects. So the idea of a museum was from its start central to this vision of MIT. It was also supposed to be a museum in the Baconian mold. In a pamphlet that William Barton Rogers wrote laying out his initial plan for MIT, he noted that, quote, in organizing and conducting the Museum of the Institute, reference should be had to the extent of practical instruction to be derived from it, rather than to the multitudes of objects it might embrace. Further, he added the, quote, the great purpose of instruction should not be lost sight of in the multitudinous gathering of material. A mere miscellaneous collection of objects, however vast, has little power to instruct or even to incite to inquiry. So this wasn't a collection of stuff for collection's sake. It was a collection of stuff to help in the teaching of the Institute. So in this justification for including a museum in his grand vision, we see Francis Bacon's epistemology applied to the 19th century United States. Objects for William Barton Rogers were key tools for understanding, and they would help the US's industrial efforts by providing examples from the industrial past. Rogers saw museums as having several roles. They should have collections, of course, but these collections should serve a greater teaching purpose. But Rogers' vision actually went a little further. He envisioned the museum as a place that actively collected in the present. In his planning document, he notes that in each department of the museum, there shall be, quote, a superintending officer or curator, hey, that's me, whose duty it shall be to take charge of its collections, to attend their arrangement and preservation, to promote as much as possible the practical usefulness of his department by facilitating the inquiries of those who frequent it for instruction, as well as by laboring to enlarge its suites of illustrative objects. In Rogers' vision, the museum wouldn't look to the past to collect. It would look right next door to the strides in science and technology being made in the present day. It would capture the present so that the future could learn from it. The best laid plans, however, eventually have to crash with reality. Plans for the first building of the Institute were drafted in 1864, and here's a drawing of that first building. And it was always assumed that this building would be for the teaching portion of the Institute's vision once it was erected, but as soon as that was done, they would turn to the business of creating the second museum, the second building, which was the museum. But unfortunately, fundraising then as now proved difficult. And also then as now, the first building went way over budget and it took way longer than intended. So while it opened its doors for instruction in 1865, this first building, it wasn't until the 1870s that the building was actually completed. That's this place, then called Huntington Hall, after William Barton Rogers' death, renamed Rogers Hall. So in Huntington Hall, you had chemical, physical, mining, and metallurgical laboratories, lecture rooms, a room for that Society of Arts, the third part of the museum, a drafting room, and also a small architectural museum. And after all the time and expense and worry and begging people for money of that first building, there was actually no longer an appetite for trying to build a museum. The first building was hard enough. And a unified MIT museum wouldn't be seriously considered for another 100 years at MIT. But Rogers' vision didn't entirely disappear. It just took a different form. Some of MIT's individual departments began collecting on their own, and they collected for the same reason that Rogers thought an MIT museum would be useful, because the objects themselves are effective teachers. There are a lot of examples across many departments at MIT over its history, but I'm going to focus on one, the Department of Architecture. MIT has the oldest architecture department in the country. It was founded with the Institute in 1865 by this guy, William Robert Ware, and it emphasized both the artistic and the practical elements of an architectural education. Ware was also very enthusiastic about Rogers' initial vision, and he insisted that MIT's eventual museum contain an architecture department, something that Rogers wasn't so sure about. He's like, I don't know, is architecture really useful? Rogers was convinced. So Ware really wanted this space in the museum because he had already started to collect things to teach architecture, models, casts, and drawings. So because architecture in the United States, because the profession in the US was then in its infancy, Ware actually had to go abroad to find his examples. So in 1867, he traveled to England, and he amassed a collection of more than 200 examples of contemporary, exemplary work from architects working at the time. These were first-rate architectural drawings, as he called them, and he also said they would be an important addition to Rogers' eventual museum, and that they would be, quote, as useful to the profession as to the school, and a source of instruction and pleasure to amateurs and the public. So when Huntington Hall first opened, Ware's growing collection found a temporary home there. That was that small architectural museum. But even in that supposed temporary home, it was visited by hundreds of people. Some were members of the Boston Society for Architects, but others were simply casual visitors who dropped by when the building was open to the public, as it often was. So Ware, in effect, created a publicly accessible museum of architecture that served both his students and the public at large. And I'm happy to say that his collection is still publicly accessible in the modern MIT Museum. So Ware not only collected past examples, but he began the systematic collecting of student work, of MIT student work, to add to this growing study collection. So when he traveled to Europe to get these initial drawings, he collected the works of famous architects to show his students quality work. But in instituting a program for collecting all student theses, he was looking forward. He understood that this thesis work would be as instrumental a teaching aid in the future as the collection he picked up in Europe. And he was not wrong. The architectural thesis collection still exists today, and collecting in it lasted well beyond Ware's tenure. We have more than 8,000 drawings now. The earliest drawing in our thesis collection is from 1873. It's this lovely water tower, and the latest are from 1968. So Ware's initial idea to collect student work, it actually created an invaluable resource for modern and even future scholars. The collection today is one of the most heavily requested at the MIT Museum, and it offers a compelling chronological perspective on architectural trends, on evolving design philosophies, and the broader cultural influences on architecture. And these theses also mirror shifting societal priorities and preoccupations. For example, after the selection of routes that would make up the interstate highway system, we see a bunch of theses for hotels near highways. During the space race, we see a moon base. So Ware's impetus to collect actually lives on. The current MIT Museum has recently restarted collecting architecture theses once again after this hiatus after 1968. Our latest acquisition is Daisy Zhang's 2023 examination of the lives of the inhabitants of a small apartment building in Mexico City. You can see this is quite different from, say, that, but it's still architecture. It just shows how the profession has changed. So after a gap in this practice, we've again returned to Ware's original vision because as curators, we're making the bet that people will continue to find meaning in and learn from the work, not of the past, but of today. And this, I hope, is what Rogers had always imagined for his MIT museum. An institution that collects not the masterpieces of the past, but the work of the present. An institution that is hopeful that the items it collects and holds in public trust for future generations will not only exist in the future, but also matter in the future. The collections from the Department of Architecture are one example of a modified version of Rogers' vision. And another institution also sprung up. That's the MIT Museum. So the architecture collection was one, but in 1971, we get the actual MIT Museum. So it was established as the MIT Historical Collections. The first objects it collected were part of an exhibit project for the inauguration of the MIT president, and the collection soon grew to include other historical artifacts. In 1979, MIT designated the historical collections as a permanent museum within the institute, and in 1980, it was renamed the MIT Museum. Over time, the museum absorbed and expanded earlier MIT collecting initiatives, like the Ware Study Collection or the Architectural Thesis Collection, bringing together objects that reflect the breadth of MIT's intellectual activities. And it currently exists at 314 Main Street in Cambridge. Please come visit. So as a steward of the Institute's material history and cultural memory, the museum has a particular responsibility to preserve MIT's history, a commitment that is formally recognized in MIT's current policies, which state that, quote, all artifacts significant to the Institute's history shall be sent to the MIT Museum. This means that we remain a collecting institution and we continue to develop our collections to better reflect the changing nature of scientific, technological, architectural, and artistic practice. But this raises a question, one that takes us beyond MIT, and one that matters not just to curators, but to anyone thinking about the future. How do institutions commit to preserving things across a timescale they can't predict? And how can we think institutionally about a future we can't know? So let's fast forward to 2008. In 2008, on a remote island in the Arctic, an institution was created to house a collection. This is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. The vault itself is set inside a sandstone mountain, buried deep in the permafrost, and protected, its boosters hope, from climate change, nuclear war, asteroid strikes, and general human stupidity. Inside, there are more than 1.4 million different seed varieties. The Svalbard Seed Vault is explicitly an exercise in long-term thinking. The building itself was designed to last at least 1,000 years, and while most of the seeds themselves will not last that long, the facility is built to keep them at optimal preservation for as long as possible. In 2020, they even launched a 100-year experiment where seeds harvested in 1 year will be tested every 10 years to see actually how long they remain viable, because we don't actually know that. So in the popular press, you often hear about the seed vault in the context of possible global catastrophe, but I actually see this institution differently. I see optimism. I see an institution that believes that in 100 years' time, and perhaps in 1,000 years' time, it will still be doing the routine work of taking care of a collection of seeds for the future, just in case. The Svalbard Seed Vault isn't, of course, a museum. You can't go visit it. But it is a collection of things with meaning. Now, I'm not comparing anything like, say, this 20th century robot in our collection to millet seeds. Millet is obviously much more important and much tastier. But both the seed vault and the museum face similar questions. How do you preserve something when you can't predict what the future will need? I'm going to give you one very quick example from a display I recently worked on. It juxtaposes the work of two scientists separated by nearly a century, but engaged in the same fundamental task, using X-ray crystallography to determine the structure of a crystalline substance. On one side, we have geologist Martin Berger. In our collection, we have the entire setup he used to determine the crystal structure of the mineral marcasite in 1931. We have the crystals, we have the prepared samples, we have the cameras, we have the films, we have the glass plate negatives, we have his calculations, we have all sorts of things that led him to create a 3D ball and stick model. On the other side, we have Eric Rizal, a very recently graduated MIT chemistry PhD who developed a generative learning model called Crystallize. This model takes the data from diffraction patterns of an unknown substance, compares it to a massive data set of known crystal structures and their diffraction patterns, and then makes a determination about the structure of that unknown substance. A process that took Martin Berger a year of painstaking work would have taken seconds with this new system. And structures that Crystallize can elucidate are too complex for Berger to have ever solved in an era before electronic computing. So in that display, I did my best to present this technology to our visitors. And I was thinking about the future, because I'll be honest, I don't know yet how we can preserve something like Crystallize, an AI model. How do we preserve that for the future? I also don't know if we should in this particular instance. This is still an open question. But the question itself is important. As curators, we have to make determinations of what to preserve, even when we're not sure how to preserve it. Curators might seem like fussy people preoccupied with the past, and I will freely admit that I am both. But being a curator also means looking forward across generations and even across different conceptions of museums. Curators have always thought carefully about how we might preserve our present so that the future can look back on its own history. Museums offer us a model for long-term thinking. They show us what it looks like to think institutionally across deep time. They show us that you can make commitments that outlast any individual. They show us that stewardship is possible. They show us that you can hold things in trust for a future you can't predict, and that you can do so responsibly. The Museion of Alexandria lasted for nearly a millennium. The Ashmolean has lasted over 330 years, and it's still going. The MIT Museum has only existed for 50, but I do hope that will stick around a little bit longer. So I don't know what will matter to people 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now. It's still harder to think about the 10,000 years of the Long Now Foundation. We can't predict this future, but we can choose now to steward things carefully for a future that may value those things differently than we do. And that choice to commit to the future, even when we can't see it clearly, that's what museums have always done. That's what long-term thinking can look like. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was inspirational. Let's see. We have time for some questions. I will introduce John Goodman, who will lead the Q&A. John's one of our board members.
Well, thank you for your presentation, and thank you for tailoring it towards Long Now, which is an organization that I believe has 2 microphones. Do we have another microphone from Florida?
I think I still have my...
Oh, you got
Yes.
it. Okay. So one of the things that came through to me in your talk was that museums have sort of two functions or two personalities. One is the research and the preservation, and the other is sort of the presentation to the public. And I wondered, when you have a collection, how much of your work do you see as being a showcase for the objects, and how much do you see as a preservation of the object's purpose for research?
Yeah, that's a good question. Museums do have, I mean, I would say dual purpose, but it's more like multifaceted, and we have to do so many things. We try to balance them to the needs of the public we serve. So, for example, at the MIT Museum, we put on exhibitions, and we do bring these objects out to the public, and we do have to balance both our time and the resources we take for that for what we have in our collection. So when you think about museums, you often go to see things and you see all this stuff on the wall. What you're seeing is like the tip of a huge iceberg of stuff that museums have. And your question is a good one. And the answer is yes, and both, all of these things. We try to balance these collections in a way that makes sense, that fulfills our mission as a public-facing institution and a research one. A good example of this is, for example, works on paper, like the architecture collection. I'm not the curator of architecture at MIT, but I do love this collection. We put them on display a lot. Every time we put them on display, they fade a little bit. We have to balance that. How much is, we want the public to see this, we also want to preserve it. And it's a question that we grapple with.
Well, that's the idea of what you're preserving is also a question, because you have an object, but the object represents an idea, or that represents a history, and you want to preserve that as well. You want people to remember that and to take that with them going forward. So I would imagine that's part of the question of preservation. What's more important to preserve? The learning, the knowledge, or the artifact?
That's a good question. It's a little bit of both. I mean, you can have disembodied objects that you don't know what they mean. And if you don't know what they mean, why are you keeping them? Keeping objects in a museum is, we don't have infinite space. It would be nice if we did. So we have to balance both. We have to take objects that are representative of stories. We can't take every object. So we try to think, if we're thinking about telling a story to the public, what is a hero object? What is the one thing that we can take from, say, a person's lab that will allow us to communicate to the public this story? Is that enough so that in the future, our successors 100 years from now are like, why did this curator take this object in? And, as a curator, I have thought that about my predecessors. You come across like an object that says, thing from a lab. I'm like, but what thing? What lab? Why do we have this? So it is this question, like the things you take have to tell good stories, but you can't take everything. It's impossible.
So this is great, because this is my other question, which is, how, as a curator, do you tell stories with objects? Because there's labels, but no one reads labels, or no one wants to read labels. They're helpful, but if there's a way to use the objects, kind of like the finger of Galileo. People see this, oh, it's the finger of Galileo. It's like sort of has this aura around it. How do you take objects and make a story? It's like a language. You have these, building a sentence with object, object, object. How does that work? What's your secret?
Oh, if I knew, anybody here, tell me. I'd love to know. I mean, the secret is you try things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. It helps when you have a charismatic object. Galileo's finger is great. If you're going through the galleries of the Museo Galileo in Florence, you see all sorts of really cool stuff, and you're like, why is that a desiccated finger? Like, you're drawn to it because it is so weird. The fact that we have it, very weird. So sometimes you are looking for that charismatic object, that thing that will draw you to it, something shiny, something cool, something weird. And this is actually a huge problem for me. I am the curator of science and technology at the MIT Museum, and a lot of my collection, especially of the 19th century, is a gray box. It's like, oh, cool, another box, another lab instrument. They're not fun. They're not aesthetically pleasing. So you just have to find the angle or the thing. And sometimes you find, I don't know, one of the things that I love doing as a curator is finding a thing that you wouldn't expect to find in a museum, something commonplace and something ordinary that can tell a larger story. And I'm going to give one example of an object that I recently took in. It was like a date book, a diary from the 1930s. It was offered to us along with a larger collection of things related to this MIT professor, Claire Ellesmere Turner. He was a professor of public health. And we were taking in photos. And the donor offered us this date book of Professor Turner's wife. And at first I was like, oh, yeah, it's hard to say no to a donor. It's like, this was her great-grandmother's stuff, basically. And how do you tell a person like, oh, I don't know if that's important? So I actually did a little bit more research because the donor was like, no, my great-grandma, she actually worked with my great-grandpa. She did some work. So I did a little bit more research. It's like very cursory things. And it turned out that this woman had studied, had gotten a master's in public health at Harvard, something that I didn't know, that the donor didn't know either. I'm like, okay, well, this is cool. This is a story about women who helped their husbands in the early 20th century do their work without credit. Maybe we can take this date book as an example of that. Actually, as I did more research, I found more about this woman's life. She actually studied at MIT. She was a what are called special students. So it's hard to find them in the records because they don't appear in the regular list of students. She was an MIT student. She went on to get her master's. She did research, and then she got married, and her research output in terms of stuff published under her own name ended. Yeah, and that date book is not. It doesn't tell you about her research. It tells you about basically how she kept her husband's calendar. Like, okay, at 10 o'clock, there's this thing. So basically the secretarial work. And it's a mundane object, but it can tell a much larger story. It stands in for this, this thing that was going on for a long time of women helping their husbands. Yeah. So, yeah.
Do you ever, I don't know if your charter, your mission allows this, but if you know that there's something happening or you think, oh, that would be a great object to keep, can the MIT Museum go out and say, solicit donations? And
yeah, so we get things in a variety of ways. Sometimes people offer things to us, but we do, and I think it is part of our mission at the MIT Museum to actually go out and look at what is cool and interesting. What are the trends in science and technology, or for my co-curators, architecture, design, things like that. What are the things that matter today? So we definitely do go reach out, and if you go to the MIT Museum today, you'll actually see a lot of contemporary work. The last thing that I got as a loan, not as a gift, although knock on wood, is a piece of a very modern optical atomic clock. So it's this state-of-the-art, cutting-edge thing that uses an atom of ytterbium held in an optical lattice to basically serve as a timekeeper. It's such a cool piece. It's very modern. If you look at the little label next to it, it says 2026, and we opened this exhibition in February. We took the item from the lab. So we do collect.
There goes the research.
Yeah, well, they had two, but they did say, okay, but we'll lend this to you, but if ours breaks, can we take this? And I'm like, oh, I hope it doesn't break before the show ends, but yes. So yeah, we do a lot of that, and I think it's central to our mission.
Just sort of a human interest question, and then I'll pass the mic to the audience. Somewhere in your talk, you talked about how there's a certain vanity associated with collecting objects, and donors, you mentioned, can be finicky. Is that a difficult thing where donors say, well, unless you do this, if you do that, or do you have to sort of pat egos?
Yeah, so I made the point in the talk that museums sort of are no longer about the ego of one person. That's not true. Go to a museum, you'll see the this and that wing, the that and this wing, the this family, that family. There's still a lot of that. You can't put too much nuance into a 45-minute talk. So yes, there is some talking with donors, there is, of course, the idea that when somebody offers you something, they have a lot of reasons to offer you something. They may want to preserve it, and oftentimes they do. They may also want to increase their status, like, oh, I gave my thing to a museum. I mean, they also might want a tax write-off. Like, all of these things exist in the same instance. But I think that museums can manage those personal aspirations with a more public-facing one.
You're sort of the money launderers.
Oh dear.
All right, let me. Gary's got a mic if people have questions. John's got a mic too.
In a sense, is this on? In a sense, the myths of the past are the science of that era.
Oh yeah.
Science has gone through several revolutions, some of which we know quite a bit about: the Copernican revolution, Darwin's evolution theory, Wegener's continental drift notions. And Thomas Kuhn wrote a marvelous book on the foundations of scientific revolutions, or the structure, rather, of scientific revolutions. It's said that history is written by the victors. How much are we preserving the knowledge of the ones who lost?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great question. It's hard. The answer is it's hard. You go to an art museum and you see Picasso, you don't see the person who didn't do good art, or who the market or the society didn't deem was good art. So in a sense, you have to do that. And this is not just a problem for, say, curators, but historians as well. The material of the present exists for a reason. It's sometimes things are, saved by serendipity. Oftentimes, especially in a museum, they are selected purposefully. And I think that one of the things that curators have to think about is, what are we taking, and are we telling a full story of our present? And in some sense, it's hard not to. You want to take, the quote unquote winners. We're interested in Darwin's work. We're interested in Wegener's work. So it's such a good question, and it's a good reminder for all of us to read the past with a grain of salt. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Steve Wardell. I'm a Long Now member. So libraries are going through this period of reinvention right now. You can go to a library and discover a makerspace in a library with a 3D printer and a sewing machine and, and a laser lathe and a sticker maker. And you can also go to a library and rent a computer for a few hours, or a piece of AV equipment for a few hours, or find a podcast studio with cameras in a library. Are there analogous ways that museums are reinventing themselves?
Oh, absolutely. When I was doing the research for this talk, I was sort of poking around, various digitized things online, and I came across a lecture delivered at the Smithsonian Institution in 1899 by the chief curator of the Museum of the United States, which the collection of it is now the American History Museum. And he says, museums have to reinvent themselves. They have to turn into the laboratories of the present. And when I read that, it was so funny, because the MIT Museum actually recently did a strategic plan, and we have our new strategic plan for the future. And we say that the MIT Museum is going to be MIT's public laboratory. So here's this thing that 120 some years ago, somebody was saying, oh, we have to do this again. Museums, like libraries, like all institutions, are constantly reinventing themselves. So museums sometimes do have makerspaces. We have a makerspace in our collection. We're actually proud to say that we're the only MIT makerspace that is actually truly open to the public, because you don't need to be an MIT member to work in it. We have done other things. We actually partner with researchers to do live research in the museum. We do things that our predecessors would have just no ideas about. We have, now a little robot AI guide that you can ask where the bathrooms are. I don't know why we need it, but here we are. So museums can and do reinvent themselves. I think if you want like some specific examples, the makerspace example is a good one. The idea of, a museum as a place where you can hold a party or a children's birthday, that's a new thing that's going on. We do it in our museum. Other places do it too, the Science Museum. So this is what I love about museum as sort of a really long institutional thing. You get the Museum of Alexandria that doesn't look like a museum to our day. You get these collections of these Renaissance, rich people that call their collections museums, and they don't look like our museums either. But there is that core nugget, just like with a library, there's a core nugget of collecting things and collecting them for a purpose that changes and is the through line through this history of the museum as an institution, which can and should continue to reinvent itself for the future.
Thank you. Collecting is one part of the story. The other part, presumably, is the need to, in a finite space, prune that collection.
Yes.
How do you approach that decision-making and the weight of that decision-making when you're inheriting the stories and the work of curators past?
Yeah, that's such a good example. That's such a good question. So museums both hate and love the idea of in perpetuity. When we take in an object, we say, we're going to hold this in perpetuity. And we do, except when we can't or we don't see the need for it. So deaccessioning is like taking books out of a library shelf. It's a part of what any museum has to do, especially a collecting museum. It's something that we think about. So I'm speaking for the MIT Museum in particular, we do have a process for deaccessioning, and this is a process that any accredited American museum has to go through. There is a review process. We have to put a deaccession forth to an external body with our recommendations of why we think it needs to be deaccessioned. For example, we have deaccessioned a lot of things for which we have duplicates. We have a lot of duplicate surveying material. Surveying was very important for MIT history. But to get to your question of what objects do you need? Do you really need 10 levels to tell a story, or is one enough? So sometimes we do weeding of duplicates. We do weeding of things that we no longer know what the good story is about them, or sometimes things that have deteriorated. But a key part of deaccessioning for a museum that is accredited by the American Alliance of Museums, at least, is that when we get rid of something, we don't throw it away. And in fact, our first thought isn't, okay, into the trash, or okay, let's sell this and get some money off of it. When museums deaccession, the first thing we have to do is try and find another repository where this object will remain in the public view. So we try to offer it to other museums, libraries. In our case, we do offer it sometimes to MIT professors because that is still part of the public. So the idea is if you get rid of something, you try really hard to see, can this be useful for anybody else? And only then do we go through any other possibilities. Do we auction it and use the money for acquiring new collections objects, or do we dispose of it? It's not an easy decision. So every deaccession can take weeks or months of work and deliberation.
So I'm wondering, if you had unlimited funds and were building your own library and didn't ask anybody, what kinds of things would you put in it today, maybe that reflect on our future?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I would try to focus on points of conflict. We live in a time of conflict. but humans have always lived in times of conflicts. Sometimes I wake up with despair in the world, and then, again, I'm a historian. I look at, people who are worried about nuclear annihilation, the doomsday clock folks, like, oh yeah, those people were also thinking that life's not going to go on very much longer. So I would collect points of conflict to show that we lived in a time now where things seemed almost impossibly conflicted, where people couldn't agree on things, with the hope that, humanity does live on and our past can learn, like, okay, things were difficult in the past, and yet somehow people persevered to continue to live in a world that hopefully, knock on wood, is better than what came before it. So I think that that's what I would focus on. Things, yeah. Oh shoot, this is so hard. I'm gonna have to think about that. Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question, but I'm gonna have to think about that.
To add a little bit
Yeah.
of answer there, I know that the Smithsonian makes an effort to collect from large demonstrations, artifacts, signs, plaques, things like that. Sort of everyday objects, but there was a demonstration. Yeah, so.
Yeah, we do have. I'm recently cataloging a collection of material from the graduate students organization. Unionization. So we have collected that. Yeah, so that's another good point. Yeah.
Actually, piggybacking on that most recent statement about using demonstrations in your public-facing role, what examples does the MIT Museum have in using demonstrations either from MIT's Physics and Structural Resource Lab or demonstrations of, say, for example, the duplicate artifacts that you mentioned, where you actually demonstrate them for the public operating so that they have an idea about the context and the processes required, in actually operating them? How much of that's done, and do you see other opportunities for that in the future for that to grow?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love these attempts to show things in operation, and sometimes it's impossible. A lot of times people say, well, why don't your old robots work? Well, our old robots don't work because we don't have, like, the PDP-10 that used to run it. We don't have the digital infrastructure. But in many cases, I actually really like to use objects in the way that they were intended. So for example, we have this collection of 19th century physics teaching instruments. I love bringing them out for people to tell them, it's part of a history lesson about what was important in the 19th century. And I give them gloves and I say, here, take this object and sterilize it, shove it in your ear while I put a tuning fork. These are museum objects, but they were designed to be used. And there's a way of understanding objects when you use them rather than when you hear about them. So as a curator, and this is not universal, and I'm definitely not speaking for everybody or for my colleagues, but my personal philosophy as a curator is that sometimes there are objects or things that are best experienced, and if those things are robust, like the instruments that were designed to be used, that I think that we should use them. And maybe, yes, maybe it means that they don't last as long. We have, for example, acquired a working, it's an electromechanic calculator that does squares, like squares and square roots. It's very cool. You put in the numbers, you hear this whirling of gears and stuff, and it spits out the answer. And it's wild to know that you're using an analog thing to get a square root. And I've run it. And I know that it's going to break one day. And I know that I can't fix it. Maybe I can find now someone who can. Maybe in the future, I can't. And maybe in the end, it no longer works. But in the time that it does, I think it's a really important way of using objects.
This may prove to be a silly question, but earlier on, when you said presenting the architectural drawings was a challenge because each time you do, they are exposed to light, and it got me thinking, what is our sort of collective obsession with seeing the original item? Why aren't you putting facsimiles? And if I went to the museum, if I saw a reproduction of an ancient document, I'm just sort of like, oh, I could have done that at home. Can you share with me your thoughts on what our obsession is and what our thrill? Why do we need to see the original machine or a print? A reproduction of a Picasso is a whole different experience, though I don't really know why, of seeing a good reprint in a book versus going to a museum.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, so it's true. We can make really nice reproductions that might fool the average visitor, especially something that's far away under glass. You create not what in the museum world is called not a reproduction, but a facsimile, so a thing that looks exactly like it. We actually have one on display, again, for light reasons, in the show on timepieces and timekeeping that actually you saw. We have this notebook. When we opened, it was the original thing. And then now it's a facsimile, and it looks just like the real thing. And I know it's not real. And there's a little sign that says, I don't know what it is. I think you're right. There's just something magical about an object from the past that somebody else worked on. I think it connects us to the humanity of these objects. Like, you realize somebody was there in an architectural drawing, spent hours, inking these things, drawing lines. You can see their mistakes. You can see where they might have had to erase something. You can see the humanity in the object. And sometimes it feels like if that just was spit out by a printer, you lose that humanity.
I just want to add, I was at an art show once, and there was an artist statement, and the artist said that her experience was that people always respond well to things that make visible, that things that show a great deal of human effort.
Yeah.
And like you said, if a printer spit it out, well, so what? The printer did it. But if someone spent hours and hours and hours with a rapidograph, you think, wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. I think people like stuff. I mean, thank goodness. Otherwise, I'd be out of a job. There's something, especially now in our increasingly digital world, I think there's something really nice about the tangible objects of the past, and something that we might not get every day. Like, I don't know, I wrote this talk entirely on a computer. I didn't take any paper notes. Like, it's not a tangible thing, but maybe I would like to see the tangible documents of, my predecessors. I think people just like stuff, which is a silly answer, but, Oh, not a silly question. Very important question.
If there's nobody looking, actually, just to follow up on that, I'll jump in. I wonder how the question of authenticity changes when you talk about, for example, using artifacts, research artifacts that you're afraid may be damaged. Would that experience be different? The thing that you're shoving in your ear, banging a tuning fork. Would a facsimile or of that be a different experience for the user as opposed to the original?
As opposed to the original. That's a very good question. Again, the irrational part of my brain thinks no. Because you can tell people this object. So in the case of that thing you shove in your ear, it's called a Helmholtz resonator. It's a brass sphere. It's meant to pick up basically the resonance frequencies of various wavelengths of sound. And I can say, hey, this object, it came from Simmons University. It was part of a set purchased by this MIT professor when he came to Simmons to create at Simmons a way of teaching that was similar to MIT. And again, this goes back to your observation at the beginning. An object isn't just the object. The object is the stories all around it. And in some sense, you lose that history and you lose those stories, and you think, well, then if it's a facsimile, well, why am I shoving it in my ear? I'm going to go home and watch YouTube instead. I don't know. I think that this might be the sentimentalist in me. There's just something lovely about the history that is imbued in an old object.
So Steve Wardell, there's some interesting stories about there's a billionaire who is buying the world's greatest ancient maps, and then he makes he digitally photocopies them and then makes that available to the whole world. And Google famously tried to photograph and transcribe every single book in the world from libraries, and that ran into problems, but they wanted to make that available to the whole world. And the guy who bought TED took their secret special video recordings and published them all, and took the TEDx brand and made the TEDx brand available to the whole world. I'm wondering, is there a program for museums to photograph in the greatest possible detail every single item in their collections, including the ones that are in North Adams, Massachusetts, in a vault that will never be opened or whatever, and just make those counterintuitive chance. Like, museums going to spend more to make what they possess less special, charge less. And who would ever do that? No one would ever do that. But when you look at examples like TED and TEDx, the number of people who watch their content went up astronomically, and then there's more people than ever paying higher ticket prices than ever to go to the main TED conference. So it didn't destroy what TED is doing. So I wonder if that's an idea in museums, where if you have something special, why not make the greatest possible copies of it and make them available to anyone at a touch of their fingertips, instead of having to go to Cambridge, Massachusetts to see it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that imperfectly, museums actually do try to do that. I think, so in my thought, I work with a collection of objects, not because, I'm a dragon who wants to hoard it and doesn't want anybody else to see the beautiful things that I don't have, but I have access to. I think that we do want to make things accessible. So I gave 2 examples from our website of the William Ware study collection, this original 1860 whatever collection, and the thesis collection. So we have digitized these things and we put them online. So you can go online and you can zoom. We digitize them at very high resolution. You can really zoom in. You can see all the little marks, and it's beautiful and it's lovely. And we, like a lot of museums, are doing that more and more. But you mentioned that, some rich guy bought up a bunch of maps, or Google was digitizing these things. So digitization is amazing, and all museums want to do more of it. It's expensive, though. It's expensive not just in you got to hire somebody to go to that vault in North Andover to grab the object, put it on a nice gray piece of paper, maybe clean it up beforehand, photograph it, edit the photograph, make sure the colors are right, and then save that photograph. I wish I had this number on hand. Our digital archivist knows more. We have a pretty small collection, but the terabytes of data that we have, not of our born digital objects, but of our pictures of objects, is kind of astronomical. So in an ideal world, you had that question of if you had unlimited money, and so if I had unlimited money, I would say, let's digitize everything and put it all online. Because again, I don't see this, well, first, museums are nonprofit entities, and museums make very little of their operating costs back in ticket sales anyway. I don't see it as cheapening, oh, no one's gonna go visit the real thing because they can just look at it online, for the same reason that I think the actual object is such a draw. I think that all museums should digitize their work and make it freely accessible so that everybody can look at it. Yeah, and if I could, I would.
All right. One more?
Yes, I'll just speak loudly. Does the self-consciousness of our age, of selfies and curation, self-curation and Facebook curation, and people sort of having this front-facing reality that really isn't very reflective necessarily of what's going on, how do you sort of account for that and represent it as part of our time, but not let it completely eclipse the demonstration of a reality that's behind that?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some sense, you think, oh, we don't have to we don't have to take care, we don't have to collect in the present because everybody is putting their entire lives online. Yeah, so it's a good question. It comes to like, what is representative of our era? And this is a question that curators do have to grapple with. Is it, the bajillions of things on the internet that hopefully the Internet Archive will keep in perpetuity, and, good on them, I hope that they do. Is it a smaller set? Do we need somebody to think, okay, in our little corner of our little museum, what are we going to tell about the present in this like deeply outward facing world? I don't know. Yeah, good question.
We have to end at some point, but we don't all have to leave the room. And it's often the case that people hang around and talk amongst themselves. So if people want to do that, if people are curious about things, and we can stay a little longer in the room, but Flory, maybe you can stay if people want to answer
Yeah, of course,
questions.
yeah.
But I think we should probably be mindful of our time and formally end our presentation and thank Flory once again.
Thank you.